From 1822 to 1839, the Paris Diorama was located on the Rue Samson near what is today Place de la République, then known as the Boulevard du Crime district, named for the melodramas that were staged there. It was across from the Vaux Hall, an amusement park imported from London, and down the street from the popular Panorama. An auditorium was built specifically for the diorama, looking much like a modern-day cinema, but with skylights intended to illuminate the painted panels, a large proscenium, and a rotating floor. The diorama's founders, Louis-Jacques Mondet Daguerre, famous for his invention of the daguerreotype and photography, and Charles-Marie Bouton, carefully studied the construction of the Panorama managed by Pierre Prévost, for whom they both had worked. And as the diorama program notes proudly state, animation is what elevates the diorama above its precursor. To create the sense of animation, Daguerre and Bouton painted an opaque linen canvas front and back. Each tableau was made, here I just wanted to show, this is a map from the period, it's hard to see, but it's right next to the area where you have Vaux Hall and the Panorama, and this was the area where the theaters were located as well. To create the sense of animation, Daguerre and Bouton painted an opaque linen canvas front and back. Each tableau was made transparent in selected areas and arranged in a deep truncated tunnel illuminated by sunlight from the overhead skylights, which were redirected with screens, shutters, and blinds. Depending on the direction and intensity of the light, the scene would appear to change. The effect was so subtle that critics were astounded, believing that they were looking at a natural scene. It's somewhat difficult to believe the reviews, which one reads in the journals today, but over and over the critics say it was exactly as if one were there. In one tableau, an avalanche disturbed a quiet alpine valley. In another, the light shifted on the lake. Of this, one critic wrote, "The change of light upon the lake is beautifully contrived. The warm reflection of a sunny sky recedes by degrees, and the advancing dark shadow runs across the water, chasing it as it were, the former bright effect before it." After 1834, Daguerre and his student Hippolyte Sebron created a refined version called the double effect diorama, thereby creating a sense of scene change. For example, in Masse de Minuit, worshippers filed into a church for prayer and out. And as in all the diorama viewings, the auditorium rotated the audience from the first to a second similarly rendered tableau. While certain dioramas included sound and installation, my favorite being an actual live sheep was brought in for one of the Alpine Valley diorama, the critics noted that it was the sense of animation that lent the diorama its thrill. Despite its novelty, I argue that the diorama was more than a technical innovation. It created a sense of suspense. In fact, it suspended its audience between clashing oppositions, creating an experiential encounter of a divided world. Politically speaking, the context for the diorama was the Restoration and the general period after the Revolution of 1789, stretching up to the July Revolution and 1848. Depending where there were various different versions of the diorama. A sharp conservative reaction saw the reestablishment of the Roman Catholic Church and the monarchy. Aesthetically speaking, Romanticism reigned, but it too consisted of a sharp divide, increasing abstraction, and we could think of Turner and Delacroix, and on the other hand, sentimental depiction of charged sites, such as in the Troubadour paintings, which both Bouton and Daguerre were aligned with. The diorama paired opposites in a number of interesting ways. Technically, obviously, it featured a two-sided image. Additionally, it featured opposing styles of depiction. Troubadour-style images of ruins and valleys were dissolved by its modern lighting effects that transformed these scenes into abstraction. And thirdly, it employed imposing subject matter. As the first diorama program notes state, the tableaux that come after these will follow the same mode of diversity. That is to say, they will never be the same genre. One will be an interior and one will be an exterior. The intention of Monsieur Bouton and Dore is not to abuse this method. They use it in their compositions only to render sensible to amateurs the difference between nature dead and nature animated, nature mort, which is, a still life, and a live life. Jonathan Crary explains in his groundbreaking study, The Techniques of the Observer, that the diorama was part of an epistemological shift in the early 19th century, what he calls the uprooting of vision from the stable optical regime of the camera obscura to that of the modern observer. While my study is in accord with this schema, I find that the diorama did not aid in this transition, as Crary claims, but in fact suspended its audience between two oppositional regimes. Secondly, rather than focusing on the apparatus and the viewer, as Crary does, I seek to place the diorama in its narrative context, and that includes the program notes, which you see on the screen, which were sold and later distributed freely at each showing, and also the operas and novels and architecture of the day, in order to understand the period specificity of this moment in which two optical regimes coexisted. While a number of contemporary studies point out the limits of focusing on the apparatus-viewer relationship, the technical apparatus, to the exclusion of the historical period, few have remedied this oversight. And I'm thinking of Eriki Hutamo's recent book, Illusions in Motion, where he notes the problematic nature of a study which only looks at the technical apparatus and yet does not offer a reading or interpretation of the context. This is probably due to the fact that there are no dioramas in existence, except for one at Brie-sur-Marne outside of Paris. So therefore, using the program notes, I hope to demonstrate that the two tableaux featured in the 1825 diorama provided viewers with two optical orientations toward the introduction of gaslight, and that these were embedded in the narrative context of the day. While one emphasized monuments, views, and a backward, sentimental-looking historiography, the other refused this sentimental gesture of monuments for a new corporeal practice that foreshadowed modernism, drawing on the fear and excitement aroused by revolution, and this also includes Lavoisier's chemical revolution, the rising industrial class, progress, and utopian fantasies. So I am going to do a sort of interpretive reading of the program notes, which, as I said, were a part of the diorama. They first were 7, 8, even 10 pages, and over time they became more abbreviated to really just sort of one-page adverts, in a sense. The program notes explain not what the diorama was, but what Dore and Bouton hoped the public would see when they viewed it, and the background information necessary to do so, thereby giving us a sense of the narrative discourses the diorama was a part of. At the same time, of course, a leap of imagination is necessary to piece together what the audience might have seen, which I will now attempt in relation to the 1825 diorama. I'm providing materials that are related to the descriptions because, as I said, there is no diorama. The 1825 diorama program begins by placing us on a path. The reader is immediately, nous sommes placés on a path southwest of Paris, and as the program states, the path leads down to the banks of the Seine, a little above the village of Sèvres, and in the other direction, en route to the Chateau of Meudon in Molyneux. Thus, a visual story unfolds. In one direction is Sèvres, which was then, as it is now, known for its porcelain, shown each year at the Louvre and discussed in the newspapers. By contrast, the Chateau of Meudon built by Louis XIV's father, fell into disrepair, was ransacked during the Revolution, fell again into disrepair, and was brought back to its, quote, ancient splendor, according to the program. And according to a Paris guide from the time, still is a domain of the crown. The path will ultimately lead us to Paris, but we have here two routes, one by way of monarchy and one by way of craft. Aside from this path offering two routes to Paris, there is a third choice, however, and this is the direction the program notes suggest by directing our gaze over the tip of the house of Monsieur Lerbourg, l'opticien. Noël Jean Lerbourg was the optician of the Observatory and of the French Navy and adoptive father to Nicolas Marie Paiement Lerbourg, who would, in 1839, design and market a daguerreotype camera and later still published Les Excursions daguerréennes, featuring views of the world's monuments. According to the program notes, we see only the tip of the home of Monsieur Lerbourg, who was then known for his telescopes. A Mr. Hofflin writes in his 1827 view of Paris that the optician's house was of central importance in the image, too central, in fact. He writes, "We wish the highlight on the small house in the foreground has been transformed to the adjoining trees to lessen the paramount attention so inferior an object, the optician's home, derives from it, and by which the chateau of Saint-Cloud, the city of Paris, and all the intermediate rich and extensive hills, valleys, villages, and glades are made to look as mere accessories." The reviewer here, I believe, fails to understand the optician's home being a central part of the image. It is the correct route to the City of Light, for it is by way of scientific innovation, industry, and optics that the diorama will lead us to the new Paris Gazomètre, the gas meter newly installed to fabricate illuminating gas for the city. But before we get to Paris, we are told by the program notes that casting a shadow over this bucolic scene is a false monument. And it reads, "The obelisk that rises above the greenery, which casts its shadow over the valley, is that useless lighthouse called the Lantern of Demosthenes, and which is a copy, merely a copy, of an ancient monument in Athens. The lantern was cast by the Trabucci brothers, shown at the Louvre in 1800, and then moved to Saint-Cloud just prior to the diorama. If we take this description metaphorically, and I believe we must, because how could this lantern cast a shadow over the entire valley? This useless copy of an original named for a Greek statesman shadows over the porcelain industry at Sèvres, which by comparison, we are told, supports a large number of workers and exports its ware to 2 continents. The program informs us that there existed previously on this site, where we now find the Lantern of Demosthenes, a chateau which was used to trick the public, who believed that prisoners in the Bastille were released upon the Queen's visit to Paris. Instead, they were moved to the chateau just outside Paris at the site of the now Lantern of Demosthenes, therefore still a site of deception. And then linking our view from the optician's home to Paris are a number of bridges, the Pont de Sèvres, the Pont de Saint-Cloud, the Pont de Nuit, a remarkable piece of construction. The bridge, a popular metaphor at the time, was used to signify, as Victoria Thompson argues, the composition of the new elites governing France, but also a more general movement towards social mobility. The Pont de Sèvres, which is pictured in the diorama, for instance, did not until 1821 become part of the network that would connect Paris to Versailles. And as the program notes state, it is due to this bridge that Napoleon was able to install a dictatorship on the ruins of democratic government. The French legislature was holding its session in Saint-Cloud when Bonaparte came running back from Egypt to seize power. Via this maze of bridges, paths, shadows, valleys, we arrive at the town of Passy and Auteuil, featuring, as it says, factories, a fire pump, a work of hydraulic engineering by Monsieur Perrier, and various useful establishments, namely the drapery works, wallpaper production, and chemical works. And finally, we are in Paris and enter according to the author, through Montmartre to notice, quote, a few monuments of significance, the first being the first structure we notice, because of its shape, is the Gazomètre, next to which stands a high, thin pyramid, the chimney of the factory where the illuminating gas is made. The Gazomètre was constructed in 1823 on the Rue du Faubourg Poissonnière in the fashionable, now 10th arrondissement. And according to the program notes, it is ringed by monuments, the colonne de la Place de Vendôme, les Invalides, et l'École Militaire, namely three monuments associated with Napoleon. By contrast, the second diorama tableau in 1825, and this is a painting by Dore after the diorama, so we have to imagine it as a scene change, is Colonnade, a vestibule in snow and fog, effet de neige et brouillard. While View of Paris depicted the gas meter as a monument, amongst other monuments, emblem of industries linked to the craftsperson and nobility, agent of change, of transformation wrought by revolution, both scientific and political, the second diorama drew upon a number of cultural narratives then circulating, which I will summarize as the magic lamp narrative. But we must first begin by noting that the central figure is holding a lamp aloft. And this is, not visible here. There's a very small figure who, under a microscope, you can actually see is holding a lamp. Although a number of the diorama images feature such a figure, this theme of gaslight was more poignantly expressed through what I'm calling the diorama effect, the shifting light. This tableau, like View of Paris, is about the place of gaslight, but there is no View of Paris and there are no monuments. Rather, it will create a gaseous effect, turning ruins into snow and fog. I note that this image on screen is Daguerre's painting, as I said, so there is a sort of shift, and according to the reviewers, the snow and the fog will creep over the left side of the vestibule to entirely cover the scene that we see here. And one reviewer wrote, the snow fell, a thick fog obscured the scene and dissipated slowly to let it then appear. Daguerre had treated this subject, and this is still a quote, already at the Theatre Ambigu Comique in 1820 in his decoration for the Mineur d'Oberval. For this reviewer, the diorama's gaseous effect was clearly related to Daguerre's work at the opera. If we follow this link, it will take us to the opera which Daguerre was most known for, Aladdin et la Lampe Merveilleuse, which he staged the same year that the diorama opened in 1822. This was staged in the Opera Pelletier, built 2 years after the assassination of the Duc de Berry. By royal decree, the opera house was razed and a new one built, and Aladdin was the first opera staged there with gaslight, both in the auditorium and in the stage sets for the first time. And here is an image, a sketch of Daguerre's for his famous Palace of Light. In the story of Aladdin, a young ne'er-do-well boy somewhere in the Orient eventually triumphs over an evil sorcerer when he comes to understand that he who holds the lamp controls the genie. And this was a image of the Duc de Berry being stabbed outside of the opera house. I'm going to return to that. Also, the same year, emerging a slim children's story called La Dernière Fée, La Nouvelle Lampe Merveilleuse, by Horace de Saint-Aubin, otherwise known as Honoré de Balzac. Rather than placing the story in a far-off location, he situated it in the countryside in France in a chemist's laboratory. Though devoted to his wife, the chemist's commitment to his science takes him from his wife and son. He soon dies, as does his wife after him, and his son is lured to Paris, the newly illuminated city of light, by an evil bourgeoise, a femme fatale, who tricks him by pretending to be a genie So dearly does the poor boy believe in fairy tales. And then we come to a warning. As a warning, this magic lamp story operates in league with a growing concern about the danger of gaslight. And in this critical essay published the same year by Charles Naudier and Amédée Pichot, and that's Naudier of Les Voyages Pittoresques, is a story they demonstrate the tangled narrative of gaslight. In this story, which is a critical essay but begins with a parable, a doctor speaks to a friend about what has become of Paris. After each of his complaints, the doctor responds to him simply by saying, "It is hydrogen gas." For Naudier and Pichot, gas was the evil genie at the root of numerous social ills, and as they wrote in the treatise, "Let us suppose the whole royal family is at the opera, the mistake of a worker at the Gazomètre, and the presence of a murderer in the crowd." And here they're referring to all of these events, the murder of the Duc de Berry, the Gazomètre, and the fall of the monarchy. And we can understand that all of these fears came together through this idea of the gas meter. The author of the program notes, however, does not describe this complex interweaving of science, Orientalism, and the sublime, but rather lists what the image might have pictured but does not, suggesting that the diorama panel cannot be understood in terms of sites, architecture, or even gaslight, the language of the previous view of Paris by Bouton. The program concludes, "Some would see in this fragment of architecture a temple built by the early Christians deep in a forest or some other inaccessible spot to shroud their worship in mystery. Others might see it as the remains of the castle where Mary, Queen of Scots, called out with all her heart for France and happiness. Others still might believe that these arches served as a refuge for Albigensians escaping persecutors. And for yet others, it might be all that is left of the mystery of the 11th century." And it goes on. It concludes, "For ourselves, we see here the vestibule of the fortified castle of the Tyran des Adrets, unless, of course, we prefer to eschew all such suppositions and, limiting ourselves to the truth, contemplate this tumble-down interior for what it is, a brilliant stage prop by Monsieur Daguerre." In this interesting passage, the program notes refuse their purpose, which is to place the picture within a historical narrative, as do the notes accompanying Bouton's view of Paris, placing the Gazomètre as it does within a topography linked by bridges and paths to an optician's home. In the view of Paris, gaslight is part of a network of industry, a viable option for France. This tableau makes an argument for gaslight, turning the Gazomètre into a monument. By comparison, the second tableau by Daguerre evaporates the historical view. While a figure holds the lamp aloft, the dangers of gaslight, namely its ability to destabilize solid forms, are enacted by the diorama effect, and this interwoven in the mind of an audience dazzled by the mystery and magic of the magic lamp. In summary, I'd like to say that these two tableaux, of course, were seen together. And thought together, the two tableaux created a sense of frisson, allowing the public to recognize, at least implicitly, the face of Paris shifting under the influence of a new form of illumination.